Let's queer up black culture now. Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Day, can't forget Bayard Rustin. Monday, January 15th, celebrates the birthday of celebrated civil rights leader Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. No figure is more closely identified with the mid-20th century struggle for civil rights than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His adoption of nonviolent resistance to achieve equal rights for Black Americans earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. But there was another Black hero of the civil rights movement which never received due recognition until recently when Netflix launched a movie based on his life. The movie was Rustin, and the unsung hero is Bayard Rustin, who organized the famous 1963 March on Washington where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic speech, I Have a Dream. Rustin was also a gay man for which he was forced to live with the constraints and prejudices of the time, including beatings and arrest. In 1953, he spent 50 days in jail and was registered as a sex offender after being discovered having sex in a parked car in Pasadena, California. But he refused to hide his sexuality. After the split from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement, Rustin went on to serve as president of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, a civil rights organization in New York from 1966 to 1979. Rustin was en route to Memphis for the April 3, 1968 MLK protests. Before he could arrive, Dr. King was assassinated. Later in life, he turned his attention to the LGBTQ+ activism and its intersection with the continuing civil rights struggle. He was the first to bring the AIDS crisis to the attention of the NAACP. Rustin died in 1987 at age 75 in New York City. In 2013, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, produced by Barack Obama and Michelle Obama's Higher Ground Productions, and directed by George C. Wolfe. Netflix Rustin is a must-watch movie. Rustin history is a celebration of the incredible contributions that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has had on the fabric of America and American civil rights.
What do you want? I'm here to see Dr. King.
Nelson, who is it?
Good evening, Mrs. King. Bayard Rustin.
Bayard Rustin.
Excuse me.
Well, if Bayard Rustin is here, then I guess we've arrived.
Dr. King. I'm gonna be blunt. You're straying from the principles of nonviolence.
In what way?
You're the leader of a nonviolent movement. And yet you have guns in your home and these armed guards outside.
Let me ask you something, Mr. Rustin. Would you risk your family for a tactic?
Nonviolence is not a tactic.
Would you risk your family?
Nonviolence is an ideology.
I have
It's
an
a movement,
obligation
a way
to
of
protect my
life.
family
It's
and
a
defend my
religion.
home.
Well, the guns don't make me feel any safer.
Just a disclaimer, that clip was not from the actual movie Rustin. It was actually from Boycott, but it was a scene with Bayard Rustin in it. I think this is great. I think Netflix, kudos to Netflix for recognizing an unsung hero. Mm-hmm. We have so many in the civil rights movement that because Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King was who he is, he overshadowed so many other leaders. And so kudos to Netflix for doing this. Rustin is a great Netflix movie. I watched it. I loved it. And, you know, kudos to somebody who's gay, who was gay back then and who had the courage to do what he did and to still forge ahead despite, being jailed, being labeled as a child molester, a sexual offender. He still forged ahead. What I love about it too was back then he had some interracial relationships, which I think is great back in those days.
For the time, he was
he was pushing it all.
He was not accused of being a child.
I'm sorry.
That's important. Also, and this clip was good in the sense that it showed that Rustin was the person who brought nonviolence to the King movement, separating it from all the other movements that were looking for civil rights at the time. That was not the case before. King didn't advocate violence necessarily, but he wasn't opposed. And Rustin changed that and really brought, because Rustin was a Quaker. So he did not abide by any kind of violence. And so that was an interesting thing. But Rustin was so much more. And it wasn't that he was out of the light because of King's he gave King the space to take up the light. He knew he wasn't the spokesperson, and he knew that King was. And it was that Rustin forged this pathway that King could walk down, which alienated a lot of people who, instead of hating King, hated Rustin, including some of the most powerful black men and others in America at that time, including Adam Clayton Powell, who was a member of the House of Representatives and was used to being the star. And it was Rustin who forged that path. And it was Adam Clayton Powell who went after Rustin and forced that split between Rustin and King when he threatened to say that King and Rustin were lovers, even though that was not true.
And you really see that depicted really well in the movie. And Coleman Domingo, who plays
openly gay.
Gay actor playing a gay man. He definitely deserves an Oscar nomination, if not the Oscar itself. I also want to recommend some important books too. Lost Prophet, The Life and Times of Bayard Rustin by John D'Amelio is amazing. Troublemaker for Justice by Jacqueline Houtman, Walter Nagel, and Michael J. Long is great, as well as Two Times on the Crosses. The Time on Two Crosses, the collected writings of Bayard Rustin, all amazing reading about him.
I have a question for the table, okay? So, I mean, he was all about world peace, even though Bayard was the one who, led the way, etc., right? Nobel Peace Prize winner, right?
King,
King was, right? Nonviolent. Bayard got to live to 75. Unfortunately, MLK did not, right? Do you think that with more time together, MLK would have been fighting for our rights too?
There is some indication that King already did. And the reality was that King was not fighting for black rights. He was fighting for universal rights.
Human rights.
Well, human rights, but also Rustin came to the civil rights movement from the labor movement. And King's last hurrah in Memphis before he was assassinated was for workers. It was workers' rights. And the March on Washington was about workers' rights. So that was a big part of what King was doing, showing that all people that were economically disadvantaged deserved equality and justice.
All marginalized people.
And to this day, it's still the largest protest of its kind to have taken place to this day.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we don't hear much about is, but King talked a lot about the beloved community. And that goes to Robert's point, was the beloved community is all-inclusive of all of us. And so that's what he fought for.
I love that.
I love that.
Okay, well then in my story, and if he would still be alive, he would be fighting for women's rights, he would be fighting for LGBTQ plus rights. I mean,
he fought for women's rights. He definitely did.
All right, well, I definitely have to watch it. It's on my queue.
You have to watch it. And read some of those books.
And read some of those books. Thank you, Greg.